So this is Joel from Tom Morgan Rodsmith. So I'm here with Craig Mathews on the banks of the Madison, which seems appropriate for today. We're just going to talk a little bit about Tom, some remembrances of Tom for the 25th anniversary, yeah, that's it.
Perfect. I miss my old buddy Tom. You know, this was some of his favorite water rivers here. The Beaver Point just across here from 8 Mile and Burnt Tree. And God, he loved to fish the Longhorn Rancho Del Creek.
Yep. Do you have any memories of fishing with Tom or fishing Morgan rods you can share?
I've got Morgan rods in my vehicle. They're always in my vehicle. you know, Tom and Jerry built a 7'3" 3-weight glass rod for me for Jackie, my wife, and I a few years back, and that's become my go-to rod for fishing small spring creeks. But I fish his 8.5 for a 4. He always insisted that was his favorite spring creek rod, and I have to agree that's an incredible casting tool, and that was Tom. You know, it had to be a good casting tool and aesthetically a nice looking rod. And God, I just love that rod. And I have an 8.5 foot 5 that I use all the time on the Madison.
Yep.
All season.
I think Craig had me a couple years ago sitting on a bench with the 8.5 5 catching fish on the Madison, which is kind of my dream. Not having to walk anywhere, just sit next to the river and catch fish.
Yeah, we were up on Sundance Bench during a caddis hatch. That was a kick.
Yep. Catching them on midgets, by the way.
Yeah, everybody thinks they're taking caddis and they're taking midges.
Yep,
you know, that was right. Tom too, fishing Odell Creek, and he would always talk about the importance of midges. And then I'd say, Tom, what's your favorite go-to midge fly? A 16 Royal Wolf.
Yeah, those are the days.
Was that old Royal Wolf?
We wish we could fish those now, right?
Oh God, you're darn right.
Yep. How has the Madison changed over the years in your view? From when Tom fished it, there were no boats then, right?
No boats.
And you guys started fishing it,
That's
and
right.
now it's a much different river.
Yeah. It's mostly a float fishing river. I mean, people float it. I don't own a boat. As a guide and outfitter, I used to, but I love to fish this river by wading it. I might, and Tom was the same way in terms of fishing maybe 50 yards of river the entire day, and that's exactly what we do. Pick the pockets, look for noses coming up. He just loved to hunt fish, and me too.
Yeah. And
it may be an 8-inch fish. I fished for a fish on the Firehole River one time, 8.5 inch. Brown trout. Took me 3 weeks to catch it. It was just in one of those places you couldn't get a drift.
He was just hanging out.
Yeah, and Tom loved that story. I'll never forget.
It's funny, you know, we talk about that quite a bit. How you progress in fly fishing, and you know, when you start, you just want to catch a fish, and then you want to catch as many fish as you can, and then you want to catch the biggest fish you can, and then you get to the point where I think most of our customers seem to be now, where you just want to fish the leading fish.
Yeah.
For the fish you want to catch.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why I just love the Rodsmith rods, because they're dry fly fishing machines. The most perfectly crafted tool. You know, something else just hit me is Tom's love for grayling and fishing grayling. This used to be from 8 Mile up to Burnt Tree and up to Barney used to be full of grayling. I mean, we catch a lot of grayling, as was Ennis Lake.
Yeah, and there's still grayling in the lake, right?
There's a few grayling that are starting to show up more and more so here. And you know, Upper Odell on the East Fork, they did a grayling reintroduction program.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. So we'll see more and more grayling here.
What do you think they would do?
I think competition too, particularly from brown trout. I think to get out competed.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But it's so good to see them come back. And you know, I look up towards Fever Point, which of course was, Tom might have named that Fever Point, because everybody just shakes up there, you know, because there's so many big rising fish.
Yeah.
And I love to tell the story, and this is shortly after Tom passed away. And he always told me, he said, my God, when I go, I hope I can be put in these rivers down here, these waters down here. And Jerry called one day and she said, you know, we got to put Tom to rest. Could we do so on Spring Creek? So we brought Tom down to Fever Point, and I'll never forget Jerry and I and Jackie, and Jerry opened the box with Tom's ashes, and Tom took off in the wind. It was blowing a gale. And Jerry turned around with a big smile and said, God, he's in Ennis now. On his way to Butte.
Yep, on our Butte. That's funny. Did Jerry wade across the point?
No. We can drive. We can drive right up to the edge of the point. It's a Native American site there.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, one of Tom's favorite places to sit and watch the.
That's cool.
Watch the creek, because you can always see.
That's the thing with ashes. They don't always go right where
they want. No, they don't.
Especially in the Madison Valley. There's
right.
breeze sometimes. Huh.
And I remember Tom called one day and he had talked to Renee Harrop and a couple of us about tying flies for his box, his presentation box.
Yeah.
And I kind of dreaded tying some of the flies because they were tough to tie, you know, particularly the Bomber and a few others
Yeah.
for that. But that was Tom. You know, everything was so organized and meticulous with the magnets and beautiful flies that I was so honored to be a part of, and that's always been a special treasure for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think his mind had a predilection for details.
Totally, totally.
And that's a weird way to say that, but I think we're always surprised by how complicated he did things.
Yeah.
There's a joke about Germans. I don't know if you ever heard this. You say the German engineer says, if there's a more complicated way to do this, let's do that.
Let's do that.
You know, and I always feel like Tom we joke about it. He never wanted to buy something already made from the manufacturer because it wasn't exactly what he wanted. He would rather have made it himself so that it served his purpose perfectly.
Hey, and you know, you guys have
And
carried
really
on.
cool. I think he selected you guys to tie those flies for his box too.
Oh, that was so special.
Yep.
And you know, you guys have carried on that tradition in terms of how special those rods are. You haven't compromised in
Gosh,
any
we
way.
try. I think it's hard. You know, I think I've had this conversation with many people where they say, well, why doesn't somebody just leave your shop and make a rod like a Tom Morgan rod? And I think that the hardest thing to do, it's not rocket science building fly rods. It's a mechanistic thing, you know, it's a computer process.
Sure.
The hardest thing was Tom's commitment to detail and trying to focus on every single thing you do, doing every single step as well as you do, and that's how you end up with the final product. And if you skip something in the middle, the final product's not as good. It's like that sum of all parts saying, right? You end up with a product that's better than the sum of the parts. But that's the hardest thing. That's what drives us crazy a little bit. We got teased about by Per Brandon and a couple other rod makers. We had our calligrapher had written on the wrong flat. And so Tom wanted the rod, when you held it, you could see the model. If you were right-handed or left-handed, it was on the wrong flat. The rod was finished before we saw that it was on the wrong flat. So we had to strip everything off the rod, take the guides off, take the handle off, do everything over.
It's interesting.
Because Tom wanted just that arrangement of things.
Sure.
Doesn't affect the fishing, doesn't affect the rod, doesn't affect any of that stuff.
It's interesting you bring that up because the first rod Tom built for me, the 8.5 foot 5-weight graphite, I'll never forget. He put my name on it, and whoever printed my name on it, and I think it was Jerry, put 2 T's. And my Mathews only had 1 T. And that so bothered Tom. I didn't tell Tom, but he found out about it. And it drove him crazy because I would not bring that rod back to correct. And finally one day, he made me promise that I would take and return the rod. So I did, and they just made it.
And I think that's part of it too, like he taught us that. Like, it doesn't matter if the customer notices the flaw, if you know the flaw.
Yes. Yep.
And I think in his head he was like, oh, I know it's there, I have to do something about it. Yeah, so we make things in a really kind of traditional idiosyncratic way. But that's the only thing we know from him. So, you know, we know that from him and Jerry how to do that. So, yep.
Now there was another gentleman that owned a lot of Tom Morgan Rodsmith rods, and Tom and Jerry built rods from over the years, and that was Joel Doub. I don't know if that name rings a bell. Joe just passed away this winter.
That's right.
And Joe would come in the shop, and we would joke about, you know, Mathews with 2 T and how that drove Tom crazy.
Yeah, it had to be just right.
Yep.
Sure we try to remember that, I think, to remember that. Tom had this great saying. He used to say, the key is the gap between your very best work and your very worst work should be very close. So there shouldn't be much difference, even on your bad days and your good days. Yeah, so that's why it takes time to make them. Sometimes we don't make many of them because of that. Yeah.
Well, I remember an instance up here fishing with Tom and Herb Wellington, and I'll never forget. Herb was fishing one of the old Winston IM6s. I think it was an 8.5 or a 4. And Tom would say, you know, and Tom probably built the rod, and Tom would go, you know, this really isn't a 4, Herb. This really isn't a 4. I have the 4 now. And God, it would drive Herb crazy. Oh God, those were so much fun times.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
and Tom, the casts he would make and how close he could get to rising fish and how precise his casts were.
Yeah.
I mean, there was never a wasted motion.
Yeah.
And I know Herb
He
was
was
teasing
efficient.
about it. And just, I wish I had film of that.
You know, it's funny. I think of Tom as being this kind of gentle soul, but I know he was pretty competitive when it came to fishing.
Big time.
I've heard stories
Big
about
time.
him, bragging about going behind people and
Oh, yeah.
catching fish behind them, and
And
things
he
like
would,
that.
and he could.
Yeah.
And it drove people crazy. And I won't mention some of the names of these famous fly fishermen.
Yeah, yeah.
Tom could come along with that doggone Royal Wolf of his
Yep.
and just pick their pockets. And it was so awesome to witness that. Those were the best of times.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
that's great.
Tom was a dinosaur. I mean,
Yeah.
we're not going to see another Tom Morgan. Yeah, Tom was finicky in terms. Here we go again. But you know, when he would shoot a rifle or shoot a shotgun, he had to have the right gun, the right pattern, and the right grouping. Yeah,
Huh.
yeah. And we would talk about that. We talked endlessly about hatches, and a lot of people didn't know that Tom really was a hatch guy. He loved hatches and he loved fishing to fish.
Yep.
That were.
You know, it's funny. I don't know if I told you the story. When we came up here to visit, I think the first time, he said, "Well, I'll take you out fishing." So we loaded him in the bus in Novi, and we drove out to some farmer's place, Skinner Ranch out there, up by Belgrade.
Yep.
Rode way back in there, and we get there, and I think Tom was a fishing guy, right? He's a rod maker.
Right.
I'll show him my box of flies and ask him what I use. So we get there, no activity, right? So I figure I'll tie on a nymph. And I said, Tom, here's my box of nymphs. What do you think I should use? He says, no idea. I never nymph fish.
Never did fish.
And I said, you never nymph fish? He said, I don't know. Use one of those LBFs.
Yeah.
And I said, what's an LBF? He said, it's a little bitty fucker. That was it. He didn't know the patterns. He didn't nymph fish.
Yeah.
He just was not interested at all.
Not tuned into it all. Yeah, I'm liable to get a little emotional, but I remember the last time Tom came and he wanted to see Odell Creek. He wanted to see Sprinkler. And he was in Moby, and we got him down to overlook over the creek. And I'll never forget, he's looking at him through the prism glasses.
Yep.
And tears are just streaming out of his eyes. Excuse me, but
Yeah, it's his childhood.
yeah, I'll never forget, he said, one of the best days of my life. Good times.
That's a great memory. Yeah, that's a great memory. It was a special place for him. This whole area.
Yep. Again, a true dinosaur, and God bless him, and I'm so glad I knew Tom.